All right. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Zevachim Daf Yud, and we are starting on the bottom of Testament Bays, about 15 lines from the bottom, 6 lines before the wide lines. And the Gemara says Omar Rav. It really should be Omar Rava. And the Gemara says as follows: Chatas chelev. So you have a regular chatas. That's like the case of our Mishnah, where a person is bringing chatas for eating chelev. B'shogeg. Sheshachta l'shem chatas dam or l'shem avodas kochavim. So really, it should have been on chelev, but I shechted it instead for chatas dam, that I made a mistake and potentially ate dam, or for avodas kochavim. The halacha is that it's kshera. However, l'shem chatas nazir, l'shem chatas metzora, that's psula because hani olos ninu. If I brought my chatas dam, not for the sake of another actual avera, but for the sake of a chatas that would be brought for a nazir or for a metzora, which, as we've pointed out numerous times, is different. Those are not like the nazir didn't do a direct chait. It's not like he did an isser. It's just part of the process of getting out of nazirus and part of the process of getting out of metzora. So there we say that that's psulos because really it's considered to be an ola. And says the Gemara, boy Rava. Rava asks a question. Chatas chelev sheshachta l'shem chatas detumas mikdash v'kodasha. What about a chatas chelev, which was not shechted for an avera, and also not shechted for an ola, like a nazir or a metzora, but rather for tumas mikdash v'kodasha, which is an example of a korban ola v'yored. It's an example that's like a tax bracket type of korban, where it really depends how much money you make. Mahu. Mi amrinan kares kamosa, that we would say that because there's a din of kares over here, so therefore there's similarities, and therefore we should allow the chatas chelev to become kosher for the chatas tumas mikdash v'kadashav. O dilma, know that the chatas chelev is not comparable to the chatas for a tumas mikdash v'kadashav, because the tumas mikdash v'kadashav is ein kavua kamosa. That's a flexible sliding scale type of korban. Masha Enkein, our chatas is not sliding scale at all. It's a fixed amount. So this, the Gemara says on the last of the short lines, Rav Acha bre de Rava mas nikula lipsula. So before we answer the question, the Gemara says that that Rav Acha disagrees with what we learned where we just started. Where we just started, it said that Rava had said that one case was kosher and one case was puzzle. The case that he said was kosher if there's a chatas dam that was brought for the chatas of avodas kochavim. Sorry, a chatas chelev that was brought for dam or avodas kochavim, we said kshera. So Rav Acha bre de Rava basikula lipsula, we're on the first of the very long lines of Daf Testament Bays. So he disagrees with how Rava framed things. He disagrees with Rava fundamentally. The Gemara says, "My taima. Why is it that Rav Acha bre de Rava disagrees with Rava?" Because the Gemara says, "My time of ishachatos alachatas l'shem osachatas." He holds that if you have a chatas that you've separated for a specific cause, you're never allowed to change the cause. Not for dam, not for avodas kochavim, certainly not for olav yored, for the tumas mikdash v'kadashav. It's just not allowed. The chatas is always specific to the avera, which kind of makes sense to us rationally, but we're not very halachic in this way because we're not so familiar. But that's the machlokas between Rava on the one hand and Rav Acha beredi Rava, Rav Acha his son on the other. They disagree. So Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Acha beredi Rava. Rav Ashi says to Rav Acha, that's fine, but then how do you understand the Ba'aya de Rava? Because remember, Rava's question a few lines above, or 4 lines before the wide lines, asked about whether or not if there was a chatas chelev that was shechted for the sake of a chatas tumas mikdash v'kadashav, whether or not that would be valid. Now, according to the question, according to Rav Acha, this question shouldn't even get off the ground. So that's why the Gemara says that Rav Ashi asked Rav Acha, "Boya de Rava hechi mas nisula." How did you understand the question of Rava? If you're saying that both cases are usher, the chatas chelev that was brought for either dam or avodas kochavim, and if you also want to say that nazir and mitzora is also psula, so you really don't have a leg to stand on to say that maybe the olav yored should be kosher. But we know that Rava asked a question. So according to Rav Acha's understanding, that's what the Gemara wants to know. According to Rav Acha's understanding, Baya de Rava hechi mas nisula. So Amar le, Rav Acha responds to Rav Ashi and says, Anan, b'shinui bailem kamas ninala. We weren't talking about shinui kodesh, about bringing one korban for the sake of another korban. That's not what we were doing. But rather, says the Gemara, that what we're talking about is shinui bailim. The hachi masninan la, 3 lines into the wide lines on Testament Bays. This is really the question. Omar Rava, chatas chelev sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatas dam. So now it's my chelev chatas. It wasn't my chelev chatas that I'm now bringing for my chelev dam, my chatas dam. We're doing it a different way. Now it's about another person. So that's the case here. Amar Rav Chatas chelev sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatas dam v'chatas avodas kochav psula, and al mi shemechuyev chatas nazir v'chatas mitzora kshera. Let's say that my chatas chelev is going to be brought for your nazir or for your mitzora korban. So there the Gemara says that that's acceptable. That's ksherim, because by shinui bailim it's okay to change to an ola. So then Rav Acha says to Ravashi, here is what he thinks was the question that Rava was asking. Ubayan la hachi. This was the question that Rava was asking. Boy Rava, chatas chelev sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatas the tumas mikdash v'kadashav mahu. When we are talking about achatas chelev, not shinui kodesh, but shinui bailim, this is the difference between Rava and Rav Acha Berei de Rava, which is that Rava was looking at all of this as shinui kodesh. Masha'enken, Rav Acha was looking at this from the perspective of shinui bailim. So his question, Rav Acha's question of Rav Acha's version of what Rava's question was: if I have a chatas chelev and I shecht it for you, who has a chatas tumas mikdash for kadashav, and you're bringing a korban ola v'yored, so mahu, what would the halacha be in that case? A shinui bailim, where it goes from chatas chelev to tumas mikdash for kadashav, which is an ola v'yored. Miyamrina, and do we say kares kamosa or dilma ein kavua kamosa teku? Would we say that your case of shinui bailim, it still has a din of kares? It's because it's a chatos. A chatos is always brought on something that in theory could have been an isser kares had you done so b'mezid. So do we say that's similar to tumas mikdash v'kadasha, which also has an isser kares? Or no, because that the korban ola v'yored is based on your tax bracket, so therefore ein kavua kamosa teku. We don't know the answer to this question, one version or another. Okay, says the Gemara as follows. We're 4 lines from the bottom. Itmar, we have a statement from the Amoraim, a machlokes from the Amoraim. Let's say that I start out my shkita beautifully, shachta lishma. I have to bring shlamim, and I do so b'kavana. Hareni miskavein, l'kai mitzvahs bori, whatever I'm doing, perfect kavana. And then I change my kavana that lizrog dama shelo lishma. I'm doing the shkita fine. But while I'm doing the shechita, I have in mind that later when I do the zrika, that it's going to be shelo lishma. So right now I'm doing my shlamim, the shechita part. Remember 4 steps: shechita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. Say they're 5 minutes apart. By the shechita, I'm a tzaddik. But right then by the shechita, I'm also saying, yeah, but the zrika is going to be for something else. It's lo lishma. So how does that work? On the one hand, the current avoda that I'm doing is shechita, kafto referach. I'm doing a great job. But in mind, I say that when I do the zrika a little bit later, it's going to be shelo lishma. This is a machlokes amoraim, and we'll see that it is in fact a double machlokes amoraim of the same people.
You started the process like back then. It's 4 steps. You're in one. You're in.
Right, but the zrika is where the kapara is. Everyone agrees the zrika is where the kapara is.
The zrika has to be preceded by
Correct.
shechita. So
Correct.
If the shechita was done right.
Yeah, only one shita agrees with you, as you could imagine, because it is a machlokes over here. So let's see the 2 shitas over here. Rav Yochanan Amar Psula. He says that this animal is pasal. Again, you haven't even done the zrika yet. It's just your kavana at this point, but it's pasal. Rish Lakish Amar Kshera. What is the nekudas hamachlokes between Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish? So says the Gemara, Rav Yochanan Amar Psula, because mechashvin me avoda leavoda v'alfinan mimachshavas people. First of all, we can be in one avoda, which is shchita, have a thought about a later avoda, and it travels. It can do that. So my shchita was beautiful, but my kavana during my shchita for the zrika was not so beautiful, and it travels just like pigul travels, just like pigul functions. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan holds. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of meat on the bone in the Rishonim here. However, V'Reish Lakish, 2 lines from the bottom, he says, Amar Kshera. He holds like Stan wanted to hold up because Ein Machashvin Me'avoda La'avoda. Well, he doesn't say what you say, but the result is the same. I'll use your language for now. Once you start, you're good to go. Ein Machashvin Me'avoda La'avoda. Right now I'm busy. I'm doing shchita. You're having a kavan on zrika. I'm not talking about zrika now. Stop talking about zrika. We're talking about shchita now. So until you get to zrika and mess it up by zrika, you're good to go. It's not really the same, it's not the same concept that you were saying, because you're saying once you start, you're good to go. This is saying a little bit different. And this is their machlokas, that Reish Lakish holds that it's ksher because ein machashim me'avod la'avod v'lo yalfinim mimachshavas pigo.
So just to clarify, the first Mishnah we talked about kol Zevachim shenizuchu shelo lishman ksherim. It would be kosher anyway, wouldn't it? Or am I misunderstanding something here?
What?
Any korban that's brought shelo lishma is kosher except for korban pesach and nechatas, right?
Correct.
So what's the
Well, we don't know what that line means. Does that mean all 4 parts of the avoda or not? Here, what we're saying is that the first of the 4 parts you did great, but the 4th one you butchered, or you intended to butcher. So here, our case is talking about you're sitting by the shechita itself. Yeah, that's true. The verb of butchered. Yeah, it's true. I don't know. We were just talking about dad jokes on the way home from shul yesterday, mamish.
There you go.
And now I just fell into the trap. It's a shtickle, Musar. I get it now.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, seriously. So the Gemara here says this is their machlokes, but I just want to be clear. What we're not talking about is when it comes to zrika, I have the mindset of shelo b'kavana. I'm doing shchita now, and then I say my shchita is gevaldik. But when I get to zrika, I'm going to do it shelo lishma. That's the machlokas between the two of them. Because I guess, obviously, if during zrika it's shelo b'kavana, that makes sense that would not work. And v'azdu l'ta'amayu. They actually follow their own party lines. This is not the first time they had this machlokas. And we'll see a case that's similar but not identical. The Itmar, turning to the top of Yud Amud Aleph, the Gemara says as follows. Hashochet is ha-behema. If a person has a behema that they're shechting, almenas lizrok dama le'avodas kochavim, on condition. Okay, same case, but we're starting with shochet es ha-behema, right? During your shechita. So your shchita is almanas, so that when you get to the zrika, that it's going to be la'avodas kochavim, u'lahatir chelba la'avodas kochavim. It's the same idea. The shchita was givaldik, the zrika was the kavana for the zrika was really bad. It says the Gemara, same machlokes, same party lines. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura, because he holds mechashmin me'avoda la'avoda, you are able to have a mindset during shchita for a later avoda of zrika. And also v'yalfinan chutz mipnim. We're also able to learn about a chutz type of korban, which is an avodas kochavim type of korban, and apply it and learn it from pnim, from something that happens under normal circumstances in the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, there's a fluidity. If I'm sitting there by shchita and having kavan about the zrika for avodas kochavim, the korban's possible. However, Reish Lakish Omar Muteres, he says that the korban is not problematic quite yet, even though it's shocking because you're doing a shchita, which was lishma. That part wasn't the problem, but it was the almanas lizrok dama for avodas kochavim, and Reish Lakish still holds that it's mutter. That's pretty wild, by the way. Only it's provocative, not halachically, but socially. I'm doing this l'shem avodas kochavim, that he still says it's not a problem. Why? Just categorically, it doesn't work. If I'm by shchita, my kavana for zrika is irrelevant right now. I could be thinking about any avodah zarah I want. Not highly recommended. But if you did that, it would not ruin the korban because ein mechashmin avodah la'avodah. So that's the crux of their machlokas, of whether or not if I'm on step 1 of shchita, if I have a kavana for a latter step, does that matter? The answer is, according to Reish Lakish, no, doesn't matter at all. Even if it's avodas kochavim, there's nothing to worry about. You're not able to compare a chutz korban, such as an avodas kochavim korban, to something that's done in the Beis Hamikdash. You can't learn from the two. And here's a word missing in the Gemara. I have a little aleph here before v'iyashminan, and it should say v'tzriche, which makes sense because we we just had two cases that are seemingly very similar. I'll review them, but they really are very similar. One is shachta lishma, and then for the zrika it's shelo lishma. That's regular korban stuff. And the second was shachta lishma, but the zrika was l'shem avodas kochavim, which is not just lo lishma. That's a whole nother level. You can already see a baked-in difference between the cases. One of them is stam shelo lishma. The other is I'm going to do some idol worship. They're really not perfectly comparable. But the Gemara wants to know still the tzriche. Why do we need both cases? The Gemara answers up like this.
You get away just the one, right? That seems like it's a bigger
Much
for Shlomo to say in that case that it's still not a problem.
So that really shows the muscle of his shita.
That's what I'm saying. So you get away with that on the surface. You get away with that without having the need for
Correct.
the case of the bottom amount.
The fact that Rav Yochanan asers in the other direction, where it's seemingly pashut case, for sure he would aser in the. Yeah, you can learn in both directions. Reish Lakish's chiddush is in the latter case. Rav Yochanan's chiddush is in the prior. But the Gemara has to make sure that that it fits for everybody. So it says the Gemara v'tzriche 5-6 lines out. V'yashminan baha. If we only had the new case, the avodas kochavim case, baha amar Reish Lakish. Aval pnim mipnim emamodi le'le Rabbi Yochanan. But maybe he would have said that in the first case where we were doing healthy korbanos, it wasn't for avodas kuchavim. Everything's in the Beis Hamikdash, good to go. Maybe he would have been mekel. Maybe he would have been machmir and emamodi le'le Rabbi Yochanan. He would have followed Rabbi Yochanan. We have to be more careful in those cases. But if we had the first case, the non-avodas kochavim case, Rabbi Yochanan, there Rabbi Yochanan asers. Aval behahi emamodile the Reish Lakish tzriche. So actually, it's a chiddush. It's not like we said. The chidushim are not like we said. Here, the Gemara says the exact opposite of what we would have thought in the tzriche. Nevertheless, we need both cases. Otherwise, we would have made an error. Now, let's see if we can support the shitas of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish from other places. These are not typical Mari Makomos, because what the Gemara is going to do is as follows. Ki aser Rav Dimi Amar, he says, Masiv Rav Yirmiyah l'siyu'a l'Rav Yochanan. Rav Yirmiyah asked a question, and the question was a support for Rav Yochanan. We'll see three versions of that question. Rav Ila l'siyu'a l'Reish Lakish, and Rav Ila brought a support for Reish Lakish. So let's go in order. Rav Yirmiyah l'si'uha l'Rav Yochanan, put on your thinking caps, says the Gemara, what was the question that Rav Yirmiyah asked that functioned as a raya for Rav Yochanan? Let's review. The Rav Yochanan asered. If you had kavana during shchita for zrika, he asered in both cases, both regular and by avodah zarah. So what was the case that Rav Yirmiyah was asking on, quarter of the way down? Uma b'makom she'im amar hareini shochet chutz lizmano shehu kasher. If a person were to shecht right now, and he said even out loud, "I'm doing this chutz lizmano," but he doesn't do it chutz lizmano. He just says he's doing it chutz lizmano, and then he shechts lizmano. Shehu kasher. Your words are ridiculous. You just shechted during the zman. So the guy's sitting there, knife over the neck. He has 24 hours to do the shechita, and he says, "I'm doing the shechita bechavana that it's shelo bizmano," and he does the shechita. Baruch atah al shechita, and he does the shechita. What did you say? The words that came out of your mouth was "I'm doing it shelo bizmano," but the mitzias was that you did it bizmano. So the Gemara says that's kosher. Shachto almanas lizrok damo chutz lizmano pasal. This is built into his question. We didn't even get to his question yet. If you did a shchita for the sake of zrika later, that's chutz lizmano, then taka it's pasal. That's our proof for Rabbi Yochanan. Because what did he say in this part of the question? You did a shchita. During the shchita, you had kavana to do the zrika chutz lizmano, and we say pasal. That's just like Rabbi Yochanan. So then, and this is where we're building up to Rav Yirmiyah's actual question, shachto almanas lizrok damo shelo lishmo, then if you did the shchita shelo lishma, eino din sheyehe pasal. This was his question. We don't need to dig into his question. But built into his question was a line that is pure Rabbi Yochanan, which is that second line. He said, shachto almanas lizrok damo chutz lizmano pasal. I'm at the point of shchita, and I have a kavana that I'm going to do the zrika chutz lizmano, and the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah says that it would be possible. So says the Gemara, no, that can't be the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah, because maskif lo rava bar ahiloi malachutz lizmano shekain kores. You can't compare a case of chutz lizmano to a case of shelo lishma. Because if you do a korban shelo bizmano, if you have this kavana, this pigol kavana, you're chayiv kores. Masha Einkein, if you do something shelo lishma, worst case scenario, your korban's puzzle. So therefore, that can't be the question that Rav Yirmiyah even asked. Then the Gemara says, you're right. This, in fact, was the question of Reb Yirmiyah, not the one that we started with. And the Gemara says as follows. Uma makom, you're in a physical place. Shim amar hareni shochet chutz lemekomo, shu kasher. I'm in the perfect place. But I say out loud, I'm shechting this in Omaha. But you're in Mamish, the Makam Amikdash, you're in the perfect place, and you shecht. Nobody cares what you said, because Lamaisa, geographically, you're where you're supposed to be. But the second line is going to be our proof for Rav Yochanan. What is the second line of the question of Rav Yirmiyah? But a makom she'im amar hareni shochet shelo lishmo shu pasal. But if you're in a makom and you do it shelo lishmo, we would have said pasal. Now let's finish up the question, even though we have our information. Shachto al manas lizrok damo shelo lishmo eino din sheyehe pasal. So then if you do it on the condition that the zrika should be shelo lishma, pasha that it should be pasal. So this is version 2 of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and the second line over here was that line that told us that perhaps we hold like Rav Yochanan, because the second line says that if a person shechts an animal al menas to do the zrika chutz lemekomo, that it would be pasal. The Gemara throws this out too. We're halfway down. Maskif lo Ravashi, no. Ma lechutz lemekomo shekein noig b'chol azvachim. The din of doing a korban chutz l'mekomo, that applies to all animals. That's not new. That applies to all animals. Tomar b'shelo lishmo she'eno noeg ela b'pesach v'chatas. But the din of shelo lishma doesn't apply to all animals. Look at our Mishnah on Daf Beis. What are the only korbanos that are completely pasul shelo lishma? It's a chatas and it's a korban pesach. Zeo. So it's not a level playing field. You're trying to ask Rabbi Yirmiyah in your question, trying to compare chutz l'mekomo to lo lishma. That's not a level playing field. Chutz l'mekomo applies to all korbanos kimat, and the din of shelo lishma only applies to two, of chatas and of pesach. So Ella says the Gemara, Ella Amar Ravashi Hachi Kamar. He says no. There's a third version of what the question was of Rabbi Yirmiyah that proves the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, Uma b'makom shim Amar. Hareni shochet l'shem ploni shu kasher. I have kavana to shech this for another person. We would say that it's kasher. Lizrok damo l'shem ploni pasal. But if I said that I'm doing the zrika for another person, it would have been pasal. Makom shimama hareni shochet shelo lishman shu pasal. Shachtam anas lizrok daman shelo lishman eno din sheyei pasal. So this question the Gemara does accept. Again, we don't need to go into all the details of his shita because it's totally out of context. But at least this question is valid because we're comparing a kavana of shchita for another person to a kavana of shchita of zrika for another person. And here the Gemara seems to say that we have this implication from Rav Yirmiyah that we follow the shita of Rav Yochanan because he asers zrika, a kavana for zrika during shchita, which is exactly what Rav Yochanan held. And now, 2/3 of the way down, remember we had said that we had two things that were a raya, one for Rav Yochanan, one for Reish Lakish. Here's the raya for Reish Lakish. Let's remember what Reish Lakish said, both on the bottom of Testament Beis and on the top of Yud Amud Aleph, that Reish Lakish was of the opinion that if during Shechita I have kavana for Zrika Shelo Lishma that is still kosher, let's see the siyua, says the Gemara, that Rabbi Ilah l'siyua l'reish Lakish, he says lo tomar b'zrika. I don't even need a pasuk for zrika. It should be obvious that if I do something shelo b'kavana for zrika, it should be pasuk. The teisi mikal v'chomer mi beinayim mishchita v'kabbalah. I could come up with a kal v'chomer from in between the worlds of shchita and kabbalah. And so then, therefore, l'mayilchasa, why do I need a pasuk? Must be that kasav rachmana lomar de'ein mechashron me'avoda le'avoda. He says that perhaps the reason why we have a pasuk bichlal, it's like super obvious. If I do the zrika, which is the moment of kapara, and I do it shalom lishma, I don't need a pasuk for that. Any balabas would have made the same assumption. Ask any, we're balabatim, we're the biggest amaratim around. So you say to me, kapara happens at zrika. Do we need a pasuk to say that if it's shalol lishma? No, it should be obvious to us. Elamai, why was there a pasuk? So says the Gemara, it must be to teach us that ein mechashmin me'avoda le'avoda, which is whose shita? Resh Lakish. So if you have kavana during shchita for a bad zrika, we don't care. You're not up to that avoda yet. Ein mechashmin zrika. So this is the source that supports Resh Lakish. Says the Gemara, I don't know. If you have a pasuk, I could have learned it differently. Maskef la Rav Papa, the dilma de mechashven me'avoda le'avoda. Maybe the pasuk was to teach me the opposite. Maybe your assumption that the balabatish svara that shelo b'kavana by zrika is obviously pasal. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe you can't pasal shelo b'kavana, and therefore the pasuk is to teach us that you're mechashven me'avoda le'avoda, the exact opposite of what we thought. Says the Gemara, if that were to be true, if that's true, that we would have thought that perhaps it would have still been kosher, and the pasuk comes to teach me like Rav Yochanan de mechashim ne'avoda le'avoda, so then the pasuk should have said nothing, and I would have had my kal v'chomer, but that's not what happened. So says the Gemara ve'idach. Okay, I guess I hear you, but what would Rav Yochanan say to that? Ve'idach parachachi. He would have asked the following question. We said that there was this kal v'chomer that could have been learned mi beinayim mishchita v'kabbalah. Malahanach, but in regards to that kal v'chomer that was learned from shchita v'kabbalah, which is 5 lines earlier, malahanach, when it comes to shchita v'kabbalah, those need to be done shekain tu'unan safon. They need to be done on the northern side of the mizbeach. V'yeshnan bechatos apnimios, and sometimes there are korbanos that are brought like this lifnai v'lifnim inside the mizbeach hazov, inside the heichal. So therefore, you can't make that kal v'chomer. Your kal v'chomer doesn't have a leg to stand on, because what we're talking about is zrika, and you're talking about shchita and kabbalah, which have different halachos. They have to be done b'tzafon. V'idach, what would Reish Lakish say about that? He would say, Hashta miya b'shlamim kaimin. I agree with you, but right now we're not talking about that type of korban. We're talking about a shlamim. So that kind of ends that sugya midstream. Basically, we have this big machlokas, Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We're really not sure what the answer is based on the Shakla V'Tarya. If you look, you'll kind of see that by Rav Yochanan, there's a lot of Rambam letters. So let's just review the machlokas. Rav Yochanan was of the opinion that if I'm during Shchita Naiba Kavana, that the Zrikash Bishil B'Kavani says it's usher because we're mechashven me'avoda le'avoda, and seemingly the Rambam paskins that way, l'chol ha'pachos. And Reish Lakish was the Mekil. He said, no, ein mechashven. We're not mechashven from avoda to avoda, and therefore, even though had it been, let's talk about his chiddush case, even had it been for avoda zara, I'm doing a perfect shchita, the shchita is perfect, but the zrika is l'shem avodas kochavim, kosher. Huge chiddush. And seemingly we don't paskin that way. Okay, 3/4 of the way down, 15 lines from the bottom, the Gemara says as follows, Itmar, shachta lishma, lizrok dama shelo lishma. Sounds very familiar. That's our machlokes. So says the Gemara, Rav Nachman Amar Psula. Rabba, it says, can't be Rabba. Shita mikubetzes, Rava. Yeah. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman Amar Psula, Rava Amar Kshera, the Hadar Bey, and it says Rabba again, should be Rabba. The Hadar Bey Rabba Lagabe Rav Nachman Mikal V'Chomer de Ravashi. We actually do backtrack and hold like the Shita of Rav Nachman. So that gives us a conclusion to our Gemara, seemingly, that we hold like Rav Yochanan and Rav Nachman, that when it comes to a case scenario that during Shchita I have Kavana for a Zrika Shelo Lishma, we paskin the chumrah of mechashven me'avoda la'avoda, and therefore, because I'm mechashven me'avoda la'avoda, what I think about during shchita about zrika matters, and therefore it's going to be awesome. We had learned in our Mishnah on Daf Beis that the Tanakama held that there are 2 types of korbanos, that if I'm shelo lishma, the korbanos are completely pasul, a chatas and a korban pesach. Then Rabbi Eliezer chimes in, argues on the Tanakama and says, af ha'asham. So that's what we're going to be focusing on right now. Rabbi Elazar Omer Af Asham Tanya. The Brisa says we're going to see 3 different approaches within the Brisa of why Rabbi Eliezer holds that an Asham is also completely pasul if it's Shelo Lishma. Here's Rabbi Elazar number 1. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, not Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Eliezer. Chatas ba'al chet, v'asham ba'al chet. Very simple svara. We know that a chatas comes about because of an avera. We also know that an asham comes about because of an avera. So he makes a hekesh. Ma chatas shelo lishma psula. Just like by a chatas, if it's shelo lishma, the Tanakama holds, everybody holds that a chatas is completely psula. Af asham shelo lishma pasal. The same exact thing would be true with an asham that's shelo lishma. However, Rabbi Yehoshua argues on Rabbi Eliezer. Amar lo Yehoshua. He says lo. Imamris bechatas shekain dama lemala. When it comes to a chatas, the application of dam on the mizbeach was lemala. It was above. What is this talking about? So we know that from Maseches Kinim and from other places in Shas that there was a line on the mizbeach called the chut hasikra. The chut hasikra was this red line, and for most korbanos, the zrika was done below the chut hasikra. But for the chatas, it was done above the chut hasikra. So what's Rabbi Yeshua's argument? He says, Im amris bechatas shekain dama lamala, which was not true by an asham. The asham's zrika was done lemata michut hasikra. So you want to say that chatas is broad for a chait and asham is broad for a chait. Therefore, asham should also be pasal shelo b'kavana, just like a chatas. You can't say that because the chatas had the zrikas hadam above the chut hasikra, whereas the asham was below the chut hasikra. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer is an adult and he agrees. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Pesach yochiach. Don't worry. The Korban Pesach will be the proof. Shedamo lamata, ushchata shelo lishma pasal. You're right. But remember that there were two korbanos that were completely pasal shelo lishma. What was the other one? Korban Pesach. Where was its zrikas adam? Below the chut hasikra. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua, but ma'ale Pesach shekain zmano kvua. Yes, but there's a very big difference. The window when we bring a Korban Pesach is super narrow. Masha Ein Kain, your Asham is not super narrow. So again, no comparison between the Asham and the Pesach. So Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Chatas Tochiach. Yeah, but the Chatas has no time parameter, just like the Asham has no time parameter. So what would you start to expect? You'd expect this, lo re'izeh kirizeh, lo re'izeh kirizeh. We won't see that. The Gemara is going to ask why we don't see that. Omar lo Yoshua. Yoshua says, I think I don't know if this is a first in Shas. I think this is the first time we see this. Chozrani salila. Rashi lo yakum hadin. I could keep asking you these questions and you'll never answer. The Gemara is very bothered by this because this is exactly where we say lo re'izeh kirizeh, and we're going to see why we don't do that here. But both of the Tanaim here understand klor that there's no way to ask that question right now. We're not allowed to give that answer, I should say. There's no way that it works, and his questions will fall in a loop and will never have an answer. Rabbi Eliezer, skipped a word there. Chaza Rabbi Eliezer v'danu din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm makabel. Rabbi Yeshua, you said good. I'm going to actually give you a better answer than my last one. Why is it that Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah holds that like a chatas and a korban pesach, that an asham is pasal shelo lishma? Says the Gemara, chatas ne'emar bahi b'shchita. He lishma kshera, shelo lishma psula. What does he teach us? If it's done right, you're good to go. So chatas has a marimakom. Upesach also has a good marimakom. Ne'emar bo hu bezvicha, hu lishmo kasher, shelo lishmo pasal. So here comes Rabbi Eliezer with the chiddush. Guess what? By asham, we also have an available word that teaches us that it has to be lishma. Af asham ne'emar bo hu lishmo kasher, shelo lishmo pasal. So this short answer, this answer of Rabbi Eliezer is, I've got psukim. I'm good to go. Forget my svara that a chatas is like an asham. You're right, the chut hasikra was a good argument, and for whatever reason, we'll see, you couldn't learn from chatas, pesach, and asham. Fine, no problem. But I have a better marmakom. I have psukim. I have a pasuk by asham that says, who? And who teaches us that who lishmo kasher, only if the asham is done lishma, otherwise shelo lishmo pasuk. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, chatas ne'emar ba hi b'shchita. Hi lishma kshera shelo lishma psula. I agree with you on that part of your drasha. Pesach ne'emar bo hu bizvicha hu lishmo kasher shelo lishma pasuk. I agree with you on that one too. But here, Rabbi Eliezer, says Rabbi Yeshua, I don't agree with you on how you touched up the psukim by Asham. And we've actually seen this before. Says the Gemara, Aval Asham, 10 lines down, Lo ne'emar bohu, elo le'achar haktoras emurin. The word who shows up way after the shechita was done by the Asham. So you can't tell me that the word who by Asham teaches me that it has to be lishma, and if it's not, it's puzzle. Because the word who is so late in the game that you cannot argue that shelo lishma would be puzzle. V'hu atzmo lo hukteru emurav kasher. Even by the Asham, even if you didn't bring the emur, and the Asham would still be kosher. So the pasuk that you wanted to use of who by Asham to teach me that perhaps Rabbi Eliezer wants to say that perhaps the word who teaches me that it's the same as Chatas and Korban Pesach because both of them have the word who or he, and therefore an Asham Shelo Lishma is pasal like a Chatas and a Korban Pesach. Absolutely not. The word who is way too late in the psukim. So Rabbi Eliezer pivots again. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Hare Omer kachatas ka'asham. The pasuk says the first time he said the chatas and the asham are similar because they're both driven by chet. Here he has a much better marimakom. This is the pasuk that's listed over here. The pasuk reads in Vayikra Zayin kachatas ka'asham Torah achas lahen hakohen asher yichaper bo lo yihyeh. That's what the pasuk says. Kachatas ka'asham. What's the drasha? Machatas shelo lishmo pasal. Af asham shelo lishmo pasal. Givaldik. This is a much better marimakom than the others because the pasuk says openly kachatas ka'asham. I would say balabatish sounds like all the halachos apply. If the chatas has to be lishma, and if it's shelo lishma, it's pasal legamri. The same thing should be true by an asham. That should have been the svara. So says the Gemara. The Gemara. So the Gemara ends there, and the Brisa ends there, and that's the acceptance of the answer of Rabbi Eliezer. So let's just summarize. Our Mishnah has a machlokes in the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanakama says there's only two korbanos that shelo lishmar pasal, chatas and korban pesach. Rabbi Eliezer says even the asham is also not kosher shelo lishma. What's the marimakom? It's the pasuk of kachatas v'cha asham. So now let's analyze pieces of this brisa. We're going to have to stop relatively soon because we're going to be here forever. This just Gemaras are very thick. We'll catch up in June of 2027. It'll be fine. It says the Gemara Amar Mar. We saw in our brisa that Amar lo Yoshua chozrani chalila. This was the first two words on the page. What? I saw a couple of short ones down there. We'll get there. Yeah, even in the Yud, it's not so far. Just the next few bladder line. So it says the Gemara, all Yom Kippurs, whatever. So what's the problem? Rabbi Yeshua argued back, Chozrani Chalila. We wanted to say that I can show you a little bit from Chatas, a little bit from Pesach, that I could learn out Asham in a particular way. But the Gemara, the Brisa says Chozrani Chalila, that I'm just going to keep asking you questions you'll never be able to answer me. Says the Gemara, V'lei hadar dina, why don't we just respond? V'leisi b'mehatzad. We see this all the time. Why don't we say, okay, Chatas has features that Korban Pesach doesn't have. Korban Pesach has features that, okay, but they're both X and therefore Y. Why don't we just use that template? So it says the Gemara, because the question to undermine that was so obvious to both of them that they couldn't even bring up the suggested answers. Mishum, third of the way down, Di'ika lemifrach. What is the reason why we couldn't learn from Chatas and Korban Pesach? Male atzad hashava shebahen, shikein yesh bahen tzad kares. By a chatas, you only bring a chatas if had you done it b'mezid you b'chayv kares. Let's talk about chaylev. And by korban pesach, the rare mitzvah saseh, other than bris milah and this too, that's it. This is a mitzvah saseh that if you don't bring it, there's also a din kares. So it says the Gemara, not comparable to asham. And that was like so blaring to both of them that these two were kares-oriented things, chatas and korban pesach. They didn't even entertain the idea. It wasn't even asked and then rejected. It was too obvious. And it should have been obvious to us as well. Then says the Gemara, it should say Amar Mar, meaning we're analyzing another part of the Brisa. The Gemara says Amar Mar, Amar Lo Rabbi Yeshua Lo, Imam Respechatas Shekain Dama Lamala, says the Gemara that you can't compare a Chatas to an Asham because the dam of the Chatas is put Lamala Mina Sikra, it's put above the Chutas Sikra, Masha Enkin Asham. So v'lei malei, the Gemara says, why didn't you answer something different? Lo, im amris bechatas shekein nichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim. Achatas, at least on Yom Kippur, makes its way lifnai v'lifnim, but an asham never does. Why didn't you say that? So says the Gemara, great question, but that's just pasha. Well, we were not talking about lifnai v'lifnim. Bechatos achitzonos kamrina. We weren't talking about Yom Kippur. We're talking about a regular chatas. So therefore, that's not it. Why don't you argue? Says the Gemara. Shem nichnas dama lifnim psula. This is a very, very subtle din that when it comes to a chatas, if you bring the dam of a chatas, lifnai v'lifnim, a regular chatas, into the kodesh, it becomes puzzle, which is not true by an asham. We would never have known this, not regular Yudias Klalius. No. But says the Gemara, Islay the Rebbe Lazar, afa asham, because Rebbe Lazar holds that even the asham would become puzzle in the kodesh. So therefore, not a good question. Why don't we argue, says the Gemara, shekain mechaperes al chiyuve krisus, that a chatas is different than an asham, in that a chatas is powerful enough to undo kares. By definition, a chatas is brought for an isser shogeg that had you done b'mezid would have been chiv kares. Pashat that it works for kares. An asham doesn't work for kares. Why don't we say that? Says the Gemara, mechatas to shmias kol. We're not talking about a chatas of regular chatas. We're talking about a chatas of shmias kol. You might remember this language from Shabbos. The chatas of shmias kol was a sample of a korban olav yored. That is not a case of kares, and perhaps the case we're talking about is a chatas that's only dealing with an olav yored. Shekain tu'una arba matanos. Why don't we say that a chatas requires arba matanos, 4 zrikos, masha'ein kain the asham? Says the Gemara, you can't say that either. Rabbi Shmuel, to amar kol adamim tu'unan arba matanos. All of the zrikos are always in units of 4, even by the asham. Why don't we say shekain tu'una al arba kranos, that the chatas is put on all 4 corners of the mizbeach? We know that on the top of the mizbeach there were these 4 kranos. It says the Gemara, uletamech, according to you. We could have asked a whole bunch of other questions as well. Ha'ika etzba, you have to sprinkle with your finger. Ha'ika karen, it has to be on the corner of the mizbeach. Ha'ika chuda, it has to be not anywhere on the mizbeach, but on the actual 90 degree, on the sharp part of the angle where it turns, the actual corner, the edge by the corner. Could have said all that. Elachad mitrei tlas tamei nokai. There's a whole bunch of reasons. You're right. You're right. There's a whole bunch of questions that he could have asked that he didn't ask. You're right. But so what? The Maisa, the Chatas, and the Asham are different. It's already 9:30. Let's stop right here at Amar Mar, 2 lines down. Yirtzeh Hashem will try and do some catch up. As you can see, Yud Aleph is massive. Yud Beis is smaller. Yirtzeh Hashem will do as best we can. We'll stop right here. Wishing you all a beautiful night and a Gemar Chasim.